Exposing the Expositions, Chapter 4. Read by author Howdy McCoskey. Referring to Chapter 4. The Columbian Exposition of 1893. To the Chicago Exposition itself, where the photos reveal the grandeur of ancient Rome in its heyday, I suggest to watch the excellent 2005 documentary called Expo White City to get a sense of just how giant of an exposition this was. You could have been at this event for days and not come close to seeing all of it. I still use Bancroft's book as a reference, but there are so many others, some of them actual guidebooks from 1893, exactly like Lonely Planets of today. One is A Week at the Fair, illustrating exhibits and wonders put out by Rand McNally. Yes, that Rand McNally. It is a 500-page guide of every building, every entrance fee, every exhibit, every place to eat and drink. Other good sources are the books The Photographic History of the World Fair, A Sketch of the City of Chicago by James Wilson Pierce. This is great for showing drawings of the great architecture of the city, plans and diagrams of all exhibition buildings in the World Columbian Exposition, and Shep's World Fair photographs. Speaking of photographs, at the Columbia Exposition, it was forbidden to take any photos unless one paid a $2 fee. That was a massive charge at the time, and as such, almost no one took any. Special police walked around the event just to try and arrest people for taking photos. I searched the photos of the fair that do exist to see if I could notice anyone walking around with something that looked like photographic equipment. I could find no one. As such, all the photos that have come to us from the fair are generally from C.D. Arnold and William Henry Jackson. Why did they not want anyone to take photographs? The White City. The exposition covered 690 acres, 2.8 square kilometers, had 200 giant buildings, again all supposedly temporary, along with canals and lagoons. More than 27 million people attended the exposition during its 6-month run. There were only 62 million in the entire U.S. at the time. Granted, many would be repeat visitors, but still, where did all these people come from? And why were many fairgoers given things that seemed like modern passports as their entrance? Without an Eiffel Tower like Paris, Chicago's new entrant was the first Ferris wheel and a long parade of entertainment called the Midway. The exposition was an inspiration for many, including the author of Wizard of Oz, L. Frank Baum, who modeled his Emerald City after the Chicago Expo. The fair opened on May the 1st and closed October 31. It was supposed to open in 1892 to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's voyage, but the slow building process pushed it back a year. Oddly, the fair was still officially opened October 21, 1892, with something very strange. They had 100 young school children reciting, for the first time, the Pledge of Allegiance, lined up in what Wikipedia calls military fashion. The pledge was written by Francis J. Bellamy, specifically to bring national attention to the fair and the first national Columbus Day holiday. Thus, the U.S. Pledge of Allegiance is actually tied to this fair, the lie of Columbus, and the symbolism that he stands for. There would be no closing ceremony for the fair in October 1893, as just days prior, Chicago's mayor was assassinated at his home by a man supposedly upset at not getting an exposition job. In a sense, this fair opened and closed with two odd ceremonies, the children doing the Pledge of Allegiance, and at the other end a political assassination. Referring to the fair as the White City got a lot of people upset, for many felt that it was not really a nickname to describe the fair, but the ideas behind the fair. Almost immediately, black activists claimed that there were no African American exhibits or influence in any area. Frederick Douglass, Ida B. Wells, Irvin Garland Penn, and Ferdinand Lee Barnett co-authored a pamphlet called The Reason Why the Colored American is Not in the World Columbian Exposition. Eventually, some blacks were included in small ways, a sculpture or a painting exhibit. At the time, racism and segregation in the U.S., particularly in the South, were rising to new levels, which had been loosened at the end of the Civil War. Columbia. In the middle of the Great Court was a 65-foot tall statue of the Republic. It was given the nickname the Golden Lady. Most believe it was covered with gold leaf, but some speculate it might have been made out of solid gold. Made by Daniel French, who used Edith Stokes as his model, the statue stood at the casino end of the Great Basin looking towards the administration building. The statue's right hand held an orb, while an eagle with wings spread, Horus, perched on it. The other hand held a staff with a winding serpent and a plaque with the word Liberty, partially obscured by an encircling laurel wreath. The original gold did not appear on any of the exposed skin of the statue, the head, neck, or the arms. The statue survived 2 of the fires at the fair, but not the third in 1896. A 1/3 size replica was made in 1918 out of bronze and can be found today in Jackson Park. The new small version is completely gilded, thus there's no exposed non-golden skin, and the Phrygian cap is not on top of the staff but draped over it. Why did they not want to make an exact replica is beyond me. I think many people today are fooled in thinking that the current statue is the original from the fair. What was the original Golden Lady to represent? The Statue of the Republic was a statue of Columbia, of Isis, and the Statue of Liberty all in one. So who was Columbia? The exposition went by the name Columbian. The name is presented as a way to honor Christopher Columbus, the explorer. But the name was not the Columbus Explorer, but the Columbian Exposition. The word Columbia is claimed to have been derived in the 1700s out of Christopher Columbus by adding an IA to the end. The word has appeared all over the United States. The capital of the country is in the District of Columbia, which is not a state and technically not in the U.S., Columbia University, or the Columbia River. Columbia is not an explorer. She is a mythical female figure wearing an American flag and a Phrygian cap, which signified freedom and the pursuit of liberty. She is the American version of Isis. Columbia is the personification of the United States, and the name has occasionally been proposed as an alternative word for American. Thus, the Columbian Exposition can mean American Exposition, or the exposition of the mystical figure of the Americas. A related controversial idea is that the Statue of Liberty in New York has always been in the United States. Where it is placed today, on so-named Liberty Island, she sits on top of a giant, very weathered square base, which sits inside of a star fort. The Statue of Liberty was originally perceived as the personification of Columbia as Lady Liberty. I just throw that out there to show how the female statue of Columbia was seen all around the U.S., in case there's any question that the Statue of Liberty is Columbia. Look at the start of any Columbia motion picture. The statue is right at the center, with the only word Columbia, not Columbia Pictures, and then there's sort of a zoom in on the light of the torch. The Statue of Liberty is a statue of Columbia, and the statue of the Chicago World Exposition is Columbia. In 1863, a female Statue of Freedom was placed atop the United States Capitol building. A similar statue was placed above the Memorial Hall at the 1876 Philadelphia Exposition. And yes, the giant golden female statue at the Chicago Exposition in 1893 was fully known by the patrons, though called officially the Statue of the Republic, to be Columbia. By keeping that in mind, more of what was going on here may reveal itself. The main buildings. While there is lots to explore and present on this fair, we should begin with what hits most in the photographs, the giant gleaming white buildings. I will not provide the detail of every building and area of the exposition. There are many books that do just that. Here I'll give a basic overview and some of the elements that cause us to ask further questions. So big was the fair, doctors actually gave advice to people as how to attend it. Dr. Hillmantle suggested, quote, "Come to the fair early. Avoid exposure to the sun. Keep quiet during the heat of the day, and on hot days explore only a limited area. Don't loiter or saunter, but move rapidly from point to point. When examining an exhibit, stand still and take it in with the eyes and not with the feet, for nothing is more fatiguing than the constant shuffling of the body's weight from one foot to another." End quote. There were 14 great buildings, mostly surrounding a giant lake. This area was known as the Court of Honor. It was simply breathtaking. At one end was the colonnade known as the Peristyle. 3 fountains were at the other end, representing the ships of Columbus. The most magnificent was the Manufacturers and Liberal Arts Building. The Chicago Tribune remarked in 1893, without underrating the vast treasure of human history and art that were collected at Jackson Park, the buildings themselves are the greatest attraction. For vast extent, boldness of conception, wonderful engineering, faultless proportions, and impressive grandeur, the Manufacturers Building is easily the greatest of them all. It was not just the biggest building in the fair, but the biggest at the time on Earth. It was 1,650 feet long, almost 6 football fields, and covered 30 acres. At the center, it rose to a height of 200 feet, half the height of the Great Pyramid. The roof was supported on gigantic steel trusses, which spanned the entire width. 8 domes were found on either side of the 80-foot-high entranceways. Externals of the building were in Corinthian style of architecture, with many columns and arches. It was ornamented with female statues to symbolize the arts and sciences. There were 4 entrances, each being 10 feet wide and 80 feet high, and on top of which was an 18-foot-tall eagle. Outside, the building was lit by 10,000 electric lights, suggesting by some to be more than existed in all of New York City at the time. The site Chicagoology claimed the buildings were 4 times as large as the Roman Colosseum, which seated 80,000 people. At the opening ceremony in 1892, a concert was held in the Manufacturers Building, and 100,000 people were easily accommodated. In fact, organizers speculated that they could fit 300,000 people into the building. Grasp your head around the size of that. The Rose Bowl in Pasadena today holds 100,000 people for football games, yet this temporary building of wood, iron, and plaster staff could hold 3 Rose Bowl crowds at once. Inside were thousands of exhibits from countries all over the world. Just about any product anyone could think of. Chemical products, pharmaceuticals, dyes, upholstery, china, jewelry, glassware, stoves, musical instruments, medical supplies, silver, gold, books, scientific instruments, various kinds of art could be found inside. 6 massive football fields full of everything from everywhere. The long half-mile walkway in the middle was known as Columbia Avenue, and which at the center had a giant clock tower that rang every hour. The Agricultural Hall was built in the style of the Renaissance. It was 500 by 850 feet. On each side of the entrance were 50 feet high Corinthian pillars. A 100-foot rotunda was covered by a 130 feet high glass dome. It housed exhibits of agriculture, forestry, dairy, and livestock, and included amphitheaters, lecture halls, and a dairy school. The Machinery Hall was filled with giant towers, beautiful columns, and a view over the canal. It mirrored the style of the Spanish Renaissance, and it had a size of 500 by 1,350 feet, which covered 17 acres. Inside was nearly every kind of machine imaginable. The problem was that with all the workings of this time, it was just too loud for anyone to be inside the building, and that included the people who were supposed to be in there working them. The Horticultural Building was 1,000 feet long and faced the lagoon. The center pavilion was roofed by a crystal dome 187 feet in diameter and 11 feet high, to have space for the largest trees and palms that the building displayed. At each end of the building were cafes, which, like the rest of the fair, served very overpriced food and drink. The Fish and Fisheries Building was 1,100 feet long and exhibited all that one could imagine of the fish industry, including one of the first great aquariums, totaling 14,000 gallons of water, where people could see fish, sharks, and others for the like up close, probably for the first time. But there was far more. The Government Building was also massive, made to look like a copy of the Capitol in Washington. It was 350 by 420 feet. A central octagonal dome, 120 feet in diameter and 150 feet high, stood in the middle. To give you a sample of just how much each and every one of these buildings contained, if I were to list from Bancroft's book every exhibit in this just one building, it would have taken me 20 pages. The Transportation Building was 920 by 250 feet, with an interior modeled after a Roman basilica. 3 sections of the building displayed railroads, shipping, and vehicle exhibits. There was an entire section just for bicycles. 8 elevators could take people to the top of the 165-high-foot dome for views of the fairgrounds. Because it's always wise to place several elevators in a temporary building made of wood and plaster. The entrance of the building was through a giant golden door. That was more than symbolic. The Women's Building was 400 feet long and included a rotunda with a giant skylight, surrounded by a 2-story open arcade, giving the appearance of an Italian Renaissance courtyard. This building could only display objects, painting, sculpture, and writing that was created by women, or in the case of textiles, only made for women. Opposite the Machinery Hall, in the center of the Grand Plaza, was the Administration Building, with a statue of Columbus at the entrance. A general rotunda rose its gilded dome to a height of 275 feet above the grounds and resembling somewhat the dome of the Invalides in Paris. Electricity was a major part of the fair. There was a war to see who would gain the electricity rights between General Electric Company, backed by Thomas Edison and J.P. Morgan, and Westinghouse, using Nikola Tesla's alternating current system. Westinghouse won out, but not without bitter feelings between the two. They both tried to ban the other products from use at the fair. Tesla was considered a mad scientist, but that's only because he may have fully understood the ancient way of generating and using power, used in all the medieval structures. In the center of the building, and forming a part of the exhibits of the General Electric Company, was the Edison Tower, or the Tower of Light, with thousands of miniature lamps arranged in crystal. It would be like a forerunner to the main building 20 years later at the 1915 San Francisco Fair, known as the Tower of Jewels. Along with the electrical displays were Thomas Edison's kinetoscope, searchlights, a seismograph, switchboard, electric incubators for chicken eggs, and a Morse code telegraph. One of Tesla's many exhibits was called the Egg of Columbus, a metal egg that spun on a disc to demonstrate a rotating magnetic field. The electrical buildings was the only one at the fair, along with the machinery buildings with giant towers around it. The first question is why? Many of the fair buildings have domes, but only the electric and machinery buildings had towers. So why do the two buildings that need the most electricity have the towers? I think many researchers have it correct. Towers and domes are part of the ancient system of creating energy from the universe. It is possible that the electrical building was not just a place to house all the electrical exhibits, but was in fact an energy-generating power station of its own. The Palace of Fine Arts is one of only 7 structures still standing today, and is now the Museum of Science and Industry. It exhibited some of the finest painting, sculpture, and statuary in 4 great courts. The Chicago Tribune wrote of the building, "The style of architecture adapted in the building was of the Greco-Ionic order, and the blending and adaptation of what was the most perfect in the past was such as to secure an effect, if not the exact sense original, at least as great in harmony and grandeur." Around 50 feet high and resting on a basement raised 9 feet above the ground, the building is 320 by 500 feet and covers an area of nearly 5 acres. At the middle is a giant rotunda, 125 feet high, again also with a dome. The reason that the palace still exists today is because it was supposed to have been built with a brick substructure under its plaster facade. To get insurance for all the artwork, the building had to be fireproof. But why only put brick in this one building? And why only the art in this building needed insurance? Were there not priceless artifacts all over the rest of the exposition? So why did so much of the other treasures not require fireproof spaces? There are photos of the building several years later, such as in 1924, and it does look like to be in a rather bad state when the photo was taken. But is that from being a temporary structure, or from the building having actually been that old? This building will be mentioned again when I share a quote from Bancroft that may in fact show that the building narrative of these fairs are complete lies. State and country. There was far more at this fair. Each of the 48 states in the Union had their own building. Some were rather simple, some were elaborate. On one side of the lagoon was the Illinois building. Made in the shape of a Greek cross, it was 450 feet long by 160 feet wide, and of course included a 152-foot-high dome. The California building was 435 by 115 feet, built to look like the old Mission Church of San Diego, which included its main tower. Here they displayed all the fresh California produce available, as a way of promoting their state as the best place to live in the U.S. The Pennsylvania building was a colonial style of architecture and reproduced the historic clock tower with its Liberty Bell. Yes, there was a replica of the Liberty Bell here at the Exposition. Oddly, the replica bell seems to have wound up in Russia at the start of the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. What is most odd about the state buildings is the claims that at the time they were all constructed of marble to be permanent buildings. The reason having been given that each state wanted to show the others how great their state was. This information tends not to appear in current books or documentaries about the fair, because you have to start asking when you know that, why build state buildings out of marble but not the rest of them? Why tear down buildings built of marble when that would be a very difficult and time-consuming job? Secondly, they could have been used for many functions afterwards, as was the supposedly only permanent building, the Palace of Fine Arts. My feeling is that this is a glitch in the story, one that is usually glossed over but should not be. The state buildings are said to clearly have been built as permanent stone structures, yet they too came down with the rest. So what's the true story? Close to 100 countries had buildings as well. France built a recreation of the Palace of Versailles, Germany a reconstruction of a Bavarian town hall, while Japan had a beautiful pavilion on the wooded island of flowers and trees. Every country came to showcase its art, products, and country. Famed German arms manufacturer Krupp also had a massive building to showcase its guns and artillery. It was basically a showcase of what would be used in 20 years' time during the First World War. Norway had a very unique exhibit at the fair, the Viking ship. However, it was likely not so enjoyed by the fair organizers. Recall, this fair was to honor the story of Christopher Columbus and how his discovery of America made him the first European on the continent and thus the start of real history. If there was before a Columbus, it would throw off the entire myth being created. The Norwegians had long known that their Vikings had been in the Americas around 1000 AD, if not far earlier. Thus Norway built a replica of a Viking ship and had it sailed across the Atlantic, another shot in the historical arm proving such ships could make the journey, all the way to the Chicago Fair. The Viking was 76 feet long, had a single sail, and was rigged with oars. It was captained by Magnus Anderson. The Viking ship stayed in North America after the fair, Lincoln Park first, and then after 1996 to Geneva, Illinois. Interestingly, one other Norwegian building survived the fair. It was called the Norway Building and resembled a stave kirke, church. It was moved to a U.S.-Norwegian settlement after the Exposition, and some 140 years later was shipped back to Norway and put in its original building city of Orkanger. I visited this kirke in 2021, and while a nice-looking building, it was most certainly a built building of the time, though I did get an interesting energy from it. I felt as though thousands of people were going past me, which was interesting, as I later found that this building was positioned near the Great Waterway that would be first on the walkway from the large structures to the country buildings. Thus, many fairgoers would have walked right by this building to see the other buildings or the Midway. I plan further trips to this church to see if other memories of the Exposition can be discovered. The Midway. A long stretch of open space away from the main buildings became known as the Midway. While the main fair was to promote art, culture, architecture, and technology, the Midway was about vice: beer, food, dancing girls, exotic exhibits, and music. It became the main attraction of the fair, where visitors spent most of their time. The Street in Cairo exhibit was extremely popular and made to look like a giant Egyptian bazaar. Here you could get Middle Eastern food, smoke a hookah, see a dancer known as Little Egypt, who claimed to have been the first to dance a very sensual belly dance later called the Hoochie Coochie. But there was also a Moroccan village, Irish village, German village, Italian square. It was as if a small piece of everywhere on earth had a plot in the Midway. The main attraction was a new one to the world, the Ferris wheel. Designed by George Washington Gale Ferris, it was much, much larger than what we're used to today. Fair organizers wanted a landmark to match the Eiffel Tower in Paris, and this was its rival. Basically, it was designed like a giant bicycle wheel. Its top height was a massive 250 feet in the air. It held 36 cars, each carrying 40 passengers, which meant 1,440 people could ride the giant wheel at the same time. Over 3 million rode the wheel at the fair, turning in a great profit. However, this great monument did not last. It stayed in Chicago a short while, and then was used at the 1904 Exposition in St. Louis. In 1906, it was destroyed and sold for scrap iron. Then there were the anthropological exhibits. Natives from all over the world, Eskimos with their mush dogs, Penobscot wigwams, a village of supposed cannibals from Africa. The cliff dwellers featured a rock and timber structure that was painted to recreate American Indian cliff dwellings of Colorado. Basically, they were all set up as a human zoo, where white fairgoers could see who they evolved from. One anthropology exhibit had lab assistants take measurements of fairgoers, who could then see how they measured up to statues representing the ideal image of the Anglo-Saxon man or woman. These ideas were continued at future fairs. Along the lakeside was the first moving walkway or travelator. It was designed so that people could get off their boats at the end of the pier and not have to walk to the casino, where the first cafes were found. It had two different segments, one where passengers were seated and one where riders could stand or walk. However, this great new innovation soon broke down, and for most of the fair was never working. Edward Muybridge gave a series of lectures in the zoo Praxographical Hall, which was basically the first place to show moving pictures to the public. Several products that are known today were first introduced at the exposition, including Juicy Fruit Gum, Cream of Wheat, Pabst Blue Ribbon Beer, the Brownie, Quaker Oats. Scott Joplin from Texarkana played the piano. John Philip Sousa's band presented concerts. And it was the first time the Mormon Tabernacle Choir appeared outside of Utah. However, the large concerts were not well attended, given that so much exotic music from all over the world was free every day on the Midway. Congress. What were called the Congresses were very popular. They were not held at the fairgrounds per se, but in a building at Grant Park with seating for 3,000 people. They were basically 2 or 3 week-long lecture sessions on special subjects such as finance, health, women's issues, railroads, history, folklore, science, philosophy, peace, psychology, or religion. The first to open was on women's progress on May 15, 1893. The segment that gained the most notoriety was called the Parliament of the World Religions, that ran from September 11 to September 27. It is claimed to be the first gathering of representatives of all the major religious traditions from the East and the West. Here one could hear not just Christian lectures, but Buddhist, Taoist, Islamic, or Hindu. For most Americans, it would be the first time these non-Christian religions could have been encountered directly. Dr. Barrows remarked, quote, religion's great part in human history, can be impressively told. Its achievements can be narrated. Its vast influence over art, ethics, education, liberty can be set forth. Its present condition can be indicated. Its missionary activities can be described. And best of all, the spirit of mutual love, of cosmopolitan fraternity can be disclosed and augmented. End quote. Well, most of the speeches were about the wonders of following their own faith. Some of it used it as a platform to attack the present world order, such as one Hindu monk who claimed, quote, we have been told to accept Christianity because Christian nations are prosperous. We look at England, the richest Christian nation in the world. Why is she rich and prosperous? Because she has her foot on the neck of 250 million Asiatics. We read history and we see everywhere that Christianity has conquered prosperity by cutting the throats of its followers. At such price, the Hindu would have none of it. End quote. I would have been curious to have seen if there had been an audience response. And I believe his point was not to attack the foundation of the Christian religion, only to attack those who were operating nations under its name. A very interesting speaker who I would have loved to have heard was Mary C. Collins, called Winona by the Sioux Indians. She lived for many years with Sitting Bull on the prairie, and stated in Bancroft's book that she had gone back and forth among them by day and night without meeting a discourteous word or look, claiming for the Sioux a nobility of character which the world does not seem willing to accord. Even to have the complete transcript of her talk would be a gift for the world right now. Who the Expos inspired. One of the reasons I wanted to revise this book was to present some of the very unique research that has come up since the original book was written. More presentation on how the Chicago Fair specifically seems to influence some of the most important cultural and psychological elements of the whole 20th century. It will end with a more in-depth look at how ancient Egypt was presented at the fair, as another example that I will get into more when discussing St. Louis, that these expos were in fact designed to create the new historical narrative. The 1893 exposition influences directly L. Frank Baum, writer of the Wizard of Oz series, books that many believe might present insights from several areas, both positive and negative, about the nature of our reality. There are claims that the White City was his direct inspiration for his Emerald City of Oz, where people entering were set up by the wizard to wear green glasses in order to make the city appear greener than it actually was. Perhaps a reference that the White City was made to appear whiter than it really was. Another inspiration by the fair was Edgar Rice Burroughs, famous fantasy author of such things as Tarzan and the Apes and various novels on the journey to the center of the earth. His personal writings detail descriptions of his times at the exposition, where he wound up working for his father who had an exhibit at the fair. Then there is Elias Disney, father of Walt, who is claimed to have been a construction worker at the expo and later went on to have his own contracting firm in Chicago. These are three key names who shaped the next 100 years with their story. Certainly Disney's son Walt and his parks and connection with the formation of NASA was a major creator of the shaping of the minds via his retelling of old fairy tales, as well as Baum, who was in a sense creating the key fairy tale of the 20th century. Be reminded that Baum had been a writer in Kansas before the fair, where he wrote several articles at the time of Sitting Bull's death and Wounded Knee that it was time for the American Indian to be exterminated. The very Columbian westward progress the 1893 exposition symbolized. But perhaps even more bizarre is the two Egyptian temples that appeared at the exposition. The first was in the Midway, on the streets of Cairo, whose guidebook cost 5 cents. This little 3-page guide to the Temple of Luxor, spelled that way incorrectly, was a one-room exhibit inside a modified temple building with 2 obelisks out front. The guidebook gives explanations of the symbolic carvings and hieroglyphs on the walls, of which I can find no photos of, and detailing the 10 royal mummies that were on display. Another guidebook reminds that these are the 10 mummies famous from the Holy Bible, and detail each exactly how they persecuted the people of the Bible. So this exhibit was set up specifically to tell a tale of ancient Egypt. I can come up with no specific information if there were real mummies there, and if so, were they the genuine ones sent from Cairo, or generic mummies that were pretended to be pharaohs, or just made in Chicago before the fair. An article I found put out by the Field Museum of Chicago in discussion of the Egyptian mummies in its collection claimed that the mummies they currently have all came after 1894 in an expedition they took to Egypt. And the next part is important, because there were no actual mummies at the 1893 exposition. So this Egyptian temple at the fair is presenting a list of famous royal mummies on display, yet the very historians in charge of the exhibits claim there were no mummies. So who or what was on display, and why? But that is not the only odd Egyptian temple at the exposition. The Western Electric Company set up 3 displays, one of which was an Egyptian temple, that they had on the outside modernized figures and hieroglyphic inscriptions, including the addition of electric lights, as if right away blending the ancient past and the modern world in one homogeneous whole. But along with it, according to one of the 1893 guidebooks, outside most uniquely with Egyptian figures and groups associated with electricity. For instance, there's a group of Egyptian maidens of the time of Ramses II operating a telephone board, and another group of men of the same period laying telegraph lines. The conceit is very popular. They also had actors pretending to be Egyptians to act as if they were working telephones and laying in telegraph lines. I get the sense that there's actually a clue here underneath the obvious marketing tool, that this is a subtle claim that the great use of energy or electricity of the ancient past, and that the modern uses of electricity are not new inventions, but are direct descendants of that past. Same with the putting of the electric lights with the modernization of reliefs, a subtle clue to just how close the ancient past to 1893 really was. It is a reminder that as one continues to look into these fairs, the more oddities, strangeness, clues, and symbols keep appearing. They are like a never-ending research experiment. Fires. No World's Fair can be complete without fires destroying many of the buildings, and Chicago was no exception. The first fire took place during the fair in the cold storage building on July 17. This building was basically a giant refrigerator to keep cold all the meat that was being used in the fair's restaurants. It was so large that in the middle it was able to be turned into a giant skating rink, perhaps the first such indoor rink in the world. The building required a 200-foot iron chimney to run the refrigeration units, but designers believed the smokestack would clash with the fair's other buildings. To remedy this, a wooden tower topped with a decorative cupola was built around the chimney, but that made it a fire hazard. When a fire broke out that was quickly put out by firefighters, July 10, a new fire, much larger, broke out. 20 firefighters responded. Due to the great amount of smoke that they were forced to climb to the top of the tower and became trapped. With no other option, as the tower was seconds away from burning down, a few were able to slide down burning fire hoses and ropes to safety. 13 remained trapped, and most jumped to their deaths in front of thousands of witnesses at the fair. An estimated 50,000 fairgoers witnessed the fire, some with a bird's-eye view from the top of the Ferris wheel. Initially, the crowd was cheering on the firefighters, but they soon fell silent as they jumped. The fire department later reported, "Never was so terrible a tragedy witnessed by such a sea of agonized faces." The first fire following the fair at the end of the exposition came in January 1894, 3 months after the fair had ended. Thousands may have witnessed this fire as well. At least it seems that way from the standard historical sources. However, Bancroft's book lists 2 fires happening in 1894, this one in January and another in June. I have found no other sources that present there being 2 fires, only the one in January. What Bancroft provides for info for the 2 fires gets combined by history into one event. What does seem certain is that in January, basically the entire Court of Honor and many of the buildings around it went up in flames. The fire started in the casino, destroyed that building, then swept northward along the peristyle into the music hall. From there, it ran across into the manufacturer's building. For 3 hours, the flames raged along the past end of the Court of Honor, and nothing was left but charred timbers and blackened plaster. A shower of sparks fell upon the ice in the lagoon until it looked like a sea of fire. They fell upon the adjacent buildings, threatening them with destruction. It was a magnificent spectacle that drew ceaseless exclamations of wonder and awe from the spectators that crowded the grounds in the vicinity of the fire. It was the greatest pyrotechnic display of the fair." End quote. The cause of the blaze was claimed to be tramps who had been hanging around the fair after it closed down. Bizarrely, this is what the Chicago Tribune wrote. Trains were loaded down with throngs of excited people on their way to witness the great conflagration. They poured through the gate of the park as rapidly as the guards permit, and after only a small proportion of those were admitted. Nevertheless, the grounds in the neighborhood of the fire were thronged with people. But they were people of, though better class, their behavior was perfect. There was no noise, no tumult, no disorder, no disturbance of property. Everything was quiet, solemn, and decorous. Every person's judgment to be that the destruction of the buildings by fire was the best possible solution of the question of what to be done with them. Long before the climax was reached, thousands of people had walked back home. At the very moment the manufacturer building had caught thousands of people without the least excitement were leaving the grounds for home. End quote. That sounds like a very odd way to present what was the destruction of one of the great sets of architecture structures in the world. But they say more. Quote, "What a glorious sight, a magnificent spectacle, a noble end, were the benedictions pronounced by the people as they left the grounds." End quote. Really? Is that what the public, who had to see their beautiful fair buildings burned to the ground, were saying? Or what the media in control of history wanted to present what people thought? I would really like to have been there that January and asked people what they really thought of the fire. But it is the second fire that interests me, for no one else but Bancroft seems to mention it. Quote, "But that which was threatened on this winter night occurred a few months later. On the evening of the 5th of July, some lads at play near the terminal station observed a gleam of fire within, and entering the depot tried for several minutes to stamp it out. But these few minutes were fatal to the existence of several among the most sightly temples of the fair. It was a hot summer day, the buildings were dry as tinder, water was scarce, the fire engines far away, and a fierce gale was blowing from the southwest, fanning into a conflagration which, when first discovered, but was what was at first an insignificant blaze. The fire was supposed to have burned the administration buildings, the mining, and the electrical buildings, both of which were quickly ablaze. To these were added, a few minutes later, the halls of manufacture and transportation, though through the efforts of the firemen a portion of the latter were saved. Meanwhile, from the railroad terminus, the conflagration had spread to the machinery and agricultural buildings, the one being utterly destroyed and damaged beyond recognition. The burning of the manufacturers building was a sight that will never be forgotten by those who witnessed the tragic climax of the destruction of the White City. Almost as soon as the fire laid hold of its vast semicircular roof, the roof fell in, with its 11 acres of skylights and its 65 carloads of glass. Then it was seen that the whole interior was aflame, while from hundreds of windows tongues of jets of fire cast far on the dim waters of the lake and lagoon their red and fearsome glare. Presently, the flames began to totter. One after another, the huge facades flew inwardly with a deafening roar. And the mammoth temple of the Exposition, there was nothing left, save for the lurid skeleton as a wall. As to the origin of either the conflagration, nothing definite was ascertained, though both are believed to be the work of incendiaries, probably of the vagrant horde which infested the streets by day and slept at night wherever darkness overtook them." End quote. Thus, the original quote claiming that the people came out to watch the manufacturer's building burn in January is likely incorrect. That must have been the July fire. I cannot imagine so many coming out in January in Chicago to see much of anything. Secondly, it is at this July fire that Bancroft seems to suggest that all of the large buildings were destroyed. Third is the date of July 5, one day after July 4, and I wonder if this was meant to be some sort of fireworks show. Again, that no presentation is made of how the fire started, simply the suggestion of vagrants. It is not coincidental that the January fire began just as public opinion seemed to be rising to find ways to keep the structures. But following the fires, what remained of the fair were dismantled and deposited into landfills. Where are these landfills? The Columbia Exposition after this was now alive only in photographs. Well, the statue at least seems to have remained on site. That is until 1896 when, yes, another fire broke out, this time burning the statue. Or, just as likely, it was removed to be hidden in the interior of some rich person's home as a souvenir, as we will see happened to the glass dome of the Hall of Music where President McKinley was shot in Buffalo. And then the fire blamed for the statue's disappearance. From what I have learned of these fairs, I think the original statue of the Republic is still somewhere, and might be found is made of solid gold, not gilded bronze as expected. Wikipedia had this to say of the area after the fairs and its complete destruction. Jackson Park was returned to its status as a public park, in much better shape than its original swampy form. The lagoon was reshaped to give it a more natural appearance, except for the straight-line northern end, where it still laps up against the steps on the south side of the Palace of Fine Arts, Museum of Science and Industry building. The Midway Plaiance, a park-like boulevard which extends west from Jackson Park, once formed the southern boundary of the University of Chicago, which was being built as the fair was closing. The university has since developed south of the Midway." End quote. Of the goods and exhibits not sold, many were kept in the U.S., being claimed to be too costly to ship them back to where they originated. There became a great discussion as to what to do with them all. Many museums in the U.S. were demanding them. Chicago's governing board wanted them all to stay in Chicago in one collection. So they decided to create a new Columbian Field Museum, which would house everything that had been at the fair, from history to science. However, there comes a very strange paragraph next in the Bancroft book where he writes, quote, "To erect a special building for the accommodation of the museum's collections was not possible within the limit of time, nor was such a building required, for among the temples of the fair, soon to be demolished and their contents removed, there was one at least that would answer the purposes for many years to come. That was the Palace of Fine Arts, the architectural gem of the Exposition, and also one of its most substantial edifices, with spacious transcript, nave, and galleries, affording affording with its annexes sufficient space for a museum almost as large as the one at the National Capitol. Here was arranged the various groups, including contributions from nearly all the main departments." End quote. That is how the artifacts of the fair wound up in the Palace of Fine Arts originally. The problem is that the above comment claimed that there was not enough time to erect a new building. What? They had supposedly just built the greatest set of buildings ever in world history in a record amount of time with 100,000 workers who should now be perfectly skilled in such building. But the claim that there's no time to build is telling. It makes one question everything about the fair. Who built it and why? And why say there was no time to build a museum building at the same moment one is building a university, a cultural center, a library, a large domed skyscraper, and more? This one quote by Bancroft pretty much sums up that the entire building story is a complete lie. As Bancroft concluded in his book, "The Columbian Exposition has fulfilled its purpose. Its mission is ended, its exhibits scattered to the four quarters of the earth, and its buildings vanished into the air." The question, of course, is just what was its real purpose, its real mission? Recall that just a few years earlier, 1891, an obscure priest in a mountain village of southern France, Berenger Saunier of Rennes-le-Château, the site of mystery, added an odd inscription to a pillar in his strange renovated church. It had the year 1891 and the word mission upside down. Thus, 1891 and 1681 are implied in the inversion. Perhaps an inversion is applied to this fair as well. If you turn the date 1893 over, you will have E 681. That could be reference to our 681 AD or 1681 AD. Recall that one of the parchments presented for this Rennes-le-Château mystery ends with the term Pax 681, a number Paul Caron believes is a special mathematical layout he calls the 681. The 681 armature. But there is more insanity. Just 10 years after the Columbian Exposition was torn down, firebombed, Chicago built, you guessed it, a giant amusement park. A park they called the White City, that began in 1905. It included, of course, Beaux Arts-style buildings, a basin, and a giant electrical tower. Thus they made the exposition in miniature. Why? Of course, most of the amusement park was for whites only. The park went bankrupt during the Depression, and only the roller skating rink stayed open, which became interestingly a part of the early civil rights movement in the 1940s, as large demonstrations occurred in order to allow blacks to join whites in the skating rink. Again, the complete detail of these expos are available in numerous free books on the internet. What this investigation is doing is trying to take those sources and find out what in them can help us understand something deeper about the purpose of these fairs and why they have been presented historically as they have been. So why did I spend so much detail on this fair? Well, as you can see, partially it was due to the size of the event. So many buildings, so many items, so many people. To really question if in fact all of these buildings could have been built in 2 years and suggested, and to keep that in mind as we continue to look at the U.S. fairs that followed after Chicago, specifically Nashville, Omaha, Buffalo, St. Louis, and San Francisco. Each of these had similar massive buildings, more strange construction photos, odd events happening within the fairs, and with the cities all overcoming great fires, or in the case of San Francisco, a very hard-to-understand earthquake. Lastly, the book will conclude with a look at ancient Rome, and what and where specifically these expositions were trying to emulate, along with a glossary of terms.